Rejoice, episode 98, Something Binary. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. While he was walking alone on Sandymount Strand at 11 o'clock in the morning on June the 16th, 1904, Stephen Didymus kept his eyes closed for a while in order to heighten his sense of the audible. He had been thinking Aristotelian thoughts as to how space and matter are identified philosophically. So, he opens his eyes, and what does he see? He sees two ladies, a little flabby, he thinks, feet splayed, descending the steps from the roadway to the sands of the beach. One of them is carrying a midwife's bag. She's a widow, Mrs. Florence McCabe from Bride Street. Although, if you heard last week's episode, number 97, you'd have heard me say that, given the famous printing errors in Ulysses, she could also have been from Bridge Street, an error of a G. Now read on as we join Stephen's thoughts while he looks at the midwife and her friend. He has just remarked to himself that one of her tribe, so to speak, hauled him kicking and squealing into the world. Here's the next quote from the novel. Here we go. And remember, it's Stephen's thoughts we're listening to. Creation from nothing. What has she in the bag? A misbirth with a trailing navel cord, hushed in ruddy wool. The cords of all link back, strand entwining cable of all flesh. That is why mystic monks, will you be as gods? Gaze in your omphalos. Hello, Kinch here. Put me on to Edenville. Aleph Alpha 001. End of quotation. First line, creation from nothing, a fleeting reference to the fact that God made the world from nothing. And Stephen links his own creation to that moment, the first moment in the book of Genesis. Why wouldn't he? Why wouldn't we all? What has she in the bag, he asks himself, and he answers himself, a misbirth with a trailing navel cord, hushed in ruddy wool. Here's a moment of potential sadness. He believes that the midwife is carrying a miscarried fetus, and that the little woolen blanket in which it was wrapped has understandably been reddened with blood, and that the umbilicus, the umbilical cord, hasn't been tidied away. Now, this is extremely interesting. This is a true slice of social history. And here's a somewhat distorted clue later in the chapter to confirm Stephen's view of it. I'm not saying that view is right or accurate, I'm just saying it's his view. If this miscarriage were not an accident of health, if it had been a deliberate and therefore illegal abortion, the two ladies, the midwife and her friend, were on their way to bury the evidence deep in the sands of the shore. That was a not unusual practice, where you had a seashore. Or in this case, leave it at the water's edge, Moses-like, for the waves to take the infant out to sea. And I hope I'm not giving too much away. Well, Ulysses isn't exactly a plot-driven suspense novel, is it? I hope I'm not giving too much away by quoting a later sentence in the chapter, because Stephen sees in the distance the two women, the two Marys, he calls them. But be careful. He thinks they're midwives, and he thinks that they are indeed Moses-like, placing a basket with a baby in it somewhere. The two Marys. But, be careful. Remember that Stephen has poor eyesight, and all may not be what it appears to be, including the women he thinks are midwives. Watch this space over the next several weeks, months, years, decades. Next line, the cords of all link back, strand entwining cable of all flesh. There's a thought beginning here. Well, actually, no, there's a thought continuing here and a major theme developing. Let's step from the pages of Ulysses a moment and go back a few months in the life of Stephen to a vital section of Joyce's earlier novel, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. A few nights ago, I reread the part where Stephen goes strolling along Mount Street in Dublin and into Merrion Square with a fellow named Lynch. And I realized that the Sandymount Strand chapter of Ulysses is in some part a continuation of the thought processes and the arguments that Stephen, in A Portrait of the Artist, advances to Lynch. For example, he discusses Aristotle with him and the aesthetics of artistic discovery and the spiritual place of the artist in the world. And listen to this. And you'll see what I mean. Incidentally, they were all major themes in Joyce's consideration. In A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, Stephen says to Lynch, here's the quote: "The personality of the artist passes into the narration itself, flowing round and round the persons and the action like a vital sea." Unquote. But ultimately, and this clinches it for me, he's talking about creation. And Stephen says, and I quote again, "The artist," this by the way is a major Joycean moment, "the artist," he says, "like the God of the creation, remains within or behind or beyond or above his handiwork, invisible, refined out of existence, indifferent, paring his fingernails." Close quotes. Not only that, turn the page and you find Lynch telling Stephen about midwives in Liverpool. That, by any standards, is one of the major considerations in Joyce's philosophy. The artist, like the God of the creation, remains within or behind or beyond or above his handiwork, invisible, refined out of existence. Don't you love that? Indifferent, paring his fingernails. So, this is what's going on. Stephen is dwelling on the idea of creation and the life that has pulsed through the entwined cords of tissue that make an umbilical cord, and how, of course, it being creation, how it all links back like a great supernatural chain links back to God. And this view of creation by God and the artist, by the way, though we'll have been years together on these podcasts before we see it together, it is going to be one of the major themes in Ulysses, because it was one of the major themes in Joyce's own life. So now, let's join all the dots. Listen to the next sentences. They are, remember, Stephen's thoughts. These are broken thoughts. He skips from one thought to the other. Sentences are unfinished. "That is why mystic monks, will you be as gods, gaze in your amphilos." Hello, Kinch here. Put me on to Edenville. On the page it looks impossible, doesn't it? Let's take it sentence by sentence as we do. Mystic monks used to gaze at their navels as part of the discipline of worship. And of course monks, certainly the Franciscans and Cistercians I saw as a boy, wore, perhaps still wear, cords around their waists as belts. Will you be as gods? That's what the devil promised Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden in the book of Genesis. He tells them that the reason God doesn't want them to eat the apple from the tree of knowledge is because, this is from Genesis, "God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil." Will you be as gods? We've already been in the book of Genesis. And why? Because Genesis is creation, and this is a chapter about creation as much as anything else. Not to mention what might have swirled around the world, knowledge, in Joyce's imagination. The apple was the fruit of the tree of knowledge, wasn't it? The word omphalos, where have you heard that before? Well, where has Stephen been earlier this morning? He's been in the Martello Tower at Sandycove. And remember that the Buck Mulligan, Oliver Gogarty, wanted to make the Martello Tower the omphalos of Ireland, modelling the navel of the world at the Temple of Apollo at Delphi in Greece, which is where the world's navel is, in classical literature anyway. And the next thought that Stephen has is playful. A lot of fun here. Stephen makes an imaginary telephone call to the Garden of Eden, Edenville. But listen to what he says, or rather thinks. "Hello, Kinch here. Put me on to Edenville, Aleph Alpha, 001. The mathematicians among you will laugh out loud at this. Look to your numbers for the pride of place that Aleph has, and it has a prime place too, if I may use the word, in linguistics. It's the first word of the old Hebrew alphabet, and it's the first letter in one of the ancient Semitic terms for the word true or truth, and it has about a dozen other applications across that biblical and Arabic world. And here's one this passage has, by way of reference, that maybe Joyce didn't think about. Or what the hell, maybe he did think about it. Kinch, he's using the mocking name that Buck Mulligan gave him. Put me on to Edenville, a mockery of suburbia, no less. And here's the one that he didn't know about, or couldn't possibly have known about, perhaps. You could read Aleph Alpha 001 as what? As binary code. 01, 0110, whatever. But could Joyce have known about binary code? Did that old bugger know everything? Well, here's one last thought this week. Joyce was definitely aware, because he was aware of all these guys, of Leibniz, the German philosopher, so interested in expressing matter through numbers. And remember Joyce's eyesight problems. Think of another person who was interested in expressing through numbers and other forms. The name of Louis Braille was at the height of its fame when Joyce was a student. More next week.
The Storytellers, Frank Delaney's mythic series of short stories written in the narrative tradition, available for download at Amazon, or learn more at frankdelaney.com.
Rejoice, episode 100, Carnival Knowledge. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. 100? Can you believe it? And that's only the weekly identifying tag number. It doesn't include at least 8 special editions, bonus balls, and wraps and stuff. I wonder what the number of the final episode will be. I did a rough calculation, and it came out at 22,964. So one morning, many years from now, I will say, Rejoice, episode 22,964. However, this week, deep breath, and on we go, along Sandymount Strand in the bright sunshine of a June morning more than a century ago. Now, because we're obliged, on account of its many obscure references, to look at Chapter 3 of Ulysses through a microscope, there's always the danger of not being able to see the wood for the trees. So this week, I'll begin by reading a longer passage, and we'll see how far down we get in it. Again, it's Stephen's internal monologue, his thought. Here we go with a longer quotation. Here we go. Wombed in sin darkness, I was too, made, not begotten. By them, the man with my voice and my eyes, and a ghost woman with ashes on her breath. They clasped and sundered, did the cobbler's will. From before the ages he willed me, and now may not will me away or ever. A lex eterna stays about him. Is that, then, the divine substance, wherein Father and Son are consubstantial? Where is poor dear Arius to try conclusions, warring his life along the contransmagnificant Jewbank-tangiality? Ill-starred heresiarch, in a Greek water-closet he breathed his last, euthanasia. With beaded mitre and with crozier, stalled upon his throne, widower of a widowed sea, with upstiffed omophorion, with clotted hinder parts. End of quote. Now you see why I go slowly. So, let's make a start and see how far down we get. First sentence. Wombed in sin, darkness I was too, made not begotten. Last week, remember, we had Eve's sinful womb. Catholic Church, as I said then, blames women for everything. Expect here, though, and all through Ulysses, to find further traces of Joyce's early Catholicism, and then, as well, a tight, tough flicker of his rejection of the Church's teachings, because in the true near-satanic fashion of the rejecting atheist, at least that's how the Church would have seen it, Joyce reverses, and I'll address reverses in just a moment, he reverses the wording of the cornerstone Catholic prayer, the Nicene Creed. We used to call it the I believe in God. It goes, I believe in God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth and all things visible and invisible. I believe in his Son, our Lord Jesus Christ, begotten, not made, one in substance with the Father. And here, Stephen, echoing again Joyce's Jesus Christ, God the Father, God the Son theme, thinks, wombed in sin, darkness I was too, made, not begotten. See, he reverses it. The prayer says begotten, not made. Joyce says made, not begotten. Now, the word reverses. I said near satanic. In Satan worship, everything that is legitimately Catholic is reversed completely. Vestments and altar cloths are black, not white. Candlesticks are turned upside down, as are crucifixes, because reversal indicates looking down to hell and Satan and not up to heaven and God. How do I know all this stuff? God knows. Oops. Should I have said that? Okay. End of satanic digression. What's next? Yes, Stephen then recalls his parents in a strange and eerie objectivity. The mist of his mourning his mother is still clinging to him. He was begotten, he thinks, by them, the man with my voice and my eyes, and a ghost woman with ashes on her breath. Stephen believes that he somewhat resembles his father, old snivelling Simon Didymus, whom we shall meet, and he invokes the spectre of his mother, on whose death he has been mournfully reflecting. Now, watch out here. This is the first time in Ulysses, a novel about fathers and sons, that we see or hear of a father. We know of Stephen's dying and then dead mother, and we've heard of Mulligan's aunt, but no father until now, until we hear of the man with my voice and my eyes. Now, this may, in fact, be about Joyce and his own father, the hail fellow I met John Joyce. But this is also Homeric. You remember how the previous chapter, chapter 2, was named Nestor in Joyce's scheme of things? Well, let me take you to the figure of Nestor in the Greek myths as Homer depicted him in the Odyssey, and listen out for something in this quotation from the Odyssey. Telemachus, on whom Stephen is modelled, asks Nestor, who has fought side by side with Telemachus's absent father Odysseus, he asks him for some account of Odysseus. Here's the first part of Nestor's reply. 9 long years did we try every kind of stratagem, but the hand of heaven was against us. He's talking about battle. During all this time, there was no one who could compare with your father in subtlety. If indeed you are his son, I can hardly believe my eyes, and you talk just like him too. No one would say that people of such different ages could speak so much alike. That's the Homer quote. So that's how Joyce has Stephen recollect the father who begat him, the man with my voice and my eyes. Note eyes again. This is also, remember, a chapter about seeing and how you see things. Ineluctable modality of the visible, the famous opening sentences. Next sentence, they clasped and sundered, did the coupler's will. The coupler, C-O-U-P-L-E-R, as in couple. Stephen is actually doing the unthinkable. He's breaking one of the great taboos. He's visualizing his parents' intercourse on the night that he was conceived, what the Irish playwright Brendan Behan used to call carnival knowledge. Now, of course, we're back in creation, and we're specifically back in the book of Genesis with John Joyce and his wife May Murray Joyce doing the Lord's bidding. This is what Genesis says. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. And God blessed them. And God said unto them, Be fruitful, and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. So he made Adam and Eve, and he coupled them. And Stephen, Daedalus' parents, did as they were told of the coupler's bidding. They were fruitful. Next 2 sentences. And this is powerful stuff, not so much in terms of Ulysses, but in terms of the belief systems to which Joyce was born and had reinforced by a Catholic education. Here are the sentences. From before the ages he willed me, and now may not will me away or ever. A lex eterna stays about him. That's the end of the quote. If you happen to be looking at the text, and I hope you are, see how he and him are spelled with an uppercase H, denoting, of course, God. Why is this powerful? Because, as expressed by the greatest and deepest of the Catholic Church's theologians, God was there before God. That's the most succinct way I can put it. The lex eterna, the eternal law, was God's law. And before we can even consider creation, there was God. God was there. From before the ages he willed me, and now may not will me away or ever, meaning there will always be God, and those he created in his own image and likeness. See it as the cornerstone of Catholic creationist theology, supported down through the centuries by the Church's great thinkers, and used here by James Joyce on a wide and empty seashore to give something else, an impression of infinity. Cool? Yes? Very cool. Well, we didn't get too far, did we? 5 sentences, and the next few are full of references that need opening out, all about the Arian heresy. So we'll do those next week. Join me then.
Frank Delaney's newest novel, The Last Storyteller, is in bookstores now. To learn more, go to frankdelaney.com.
Rejoice, episode 101, Who is Arius? Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. Last week, I left you with Lex Eterna, the divine law of everything that God always was and ever shall be. This week, we take up that thought as it extends in Stephen's head. Here's the quote, and prepare for a jaw-breaking word, 36 letters long. Joyce loved them. Here we go. Remember, the context is Lex Eterna, the divine law, and here's Stephen's next thought. Is that, then, the divine substance wherein Father and Son are consubstantial? Where is poor dear Arius to try conclusions? Warring his life long upon the contrans magnificam Jew-bank-chantiality? Ill-starred heresiarch. In a Greek water-closet he breathed his last. Euthanasia. With beaded mitre and with crozier, stalled upon his throne, widower of a widowed sea, with upstiffed omophorium, with clotted hinderparts. End of quote. Wow. Okay, let's start. Is that then the divine substance wherein Father and Son are consubstantial? Let's reflect on this thought of Stephen's for a moment. Father and Son, which, in the case of Ulysses, the novel, also means Stephen and his father Simon, and of course therefore also means Joyce and his father John, to whom Joyce was compellingly bound all his life. The divine substance being the essence of creation, the word consubstantial was never likely to be far away, and after the word consubstantial, the name of Arius was bound to come whistling through. As followers of Snoopy will know, it's time for the phrase, "Splain, Lucy." In the year 325, the Emperor Constantine presided over a council of Christian churches at Nicaea in Turkey, on the shores of Lake Iznik. It's about a 2-hour drive by the roads as they are today from Istanbul. It was an assembly of Christian bishops, and it was the first attempt of its size to try and standardize the expression of Christian belief, and it led, for example, to the Nicene Creed, I believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, that we were talking about last week. The other and more crucial decision that the council came to is the one here in Stephen's mind, that Jesus Christ was not merely the messenger of God the Father, but was also God in himself, and that the Father and the Son were one in divinity. So, let me just repeat the sentence from Ulysses. Is that, then, the divine substance wherein Father and Son are consubstantial? The divine substance is, in one sense, divinity, the being God, because to be God meant to have been there before anything ever was, and to be there after anything is. Got that? Good. Now we get to the drama. Next sentence. Where is poor dear Arius to try conclusions? In one sentence there, a bunch of stuff. Poor dear Arius remains probably the most famous heretic of the early Christian church, and his name and his presence and what he stood for are central to one of the major sub-themes of Ulysses and of Joyce's own life, the father-son relationship. In the Arian heresy, Arius argued, and this, for reasons of time, is an oversimplification, Arius argued that once upon a time there was only God the Father, that God the Son, Jesus Christ, had yet to arrive on the scene. The faction in Christianity who opposed Arius and denounced him as a heretic were those who had supported the idea of an eternal Trinity, God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Ghost or Holy Spirit. 3 divine beings in one God, each one God in himself. And that faction won. Arius wasn't on the floor to present his arguments, but I'll come to that in a moment. So, where was poor dear Arius to try conclusions? Ha 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 ha. Note that phrase? And where have you heard it before? And I bet you have. It's Hamlet. Whenever Joyce gets into Father and Son, Hamlet's never far away. And it's the scene where Hamlet confronts his mother in her bedchamber. Let the bloat king tempt you again to bed, he snarls. It's one of the most powerful scenes ever written for the stage. Act 3, Scene 4 of Hamlet. And essentially, when he uses the words to try conclusions, he's asking his mother to escape from the cage she has built for herself, marriage to Claudius, her brother-in-law, and throw herself off the castle roof. And then, what does Hamlet say? He says, "Good night, mother." Every time I see that, it just sticks me to my seat. But poor dear Arius, what happened to him? Joyce calls him ill-starred heresiarch, and then tells how he died. This was some time later. In a Greek water closet, he breathed his last. Euthanasia. And how come? With beaded mitre and with crosier, stalled upon his throne, widower of a widowed sea, with upstiffed Omophorion, with clotted hinderparts. A heresiarch is the leader or founder of a heresy. Arius was a cleric in Alexandria around the year 300, and he was denounced roundly and soundly for his insistence that Jesus was the Son of God and not in himself divine. And he wasn't the first, of course. In fact, Arius was merely the intensifier of an argument that had been around for a long time. There were all kinds of legends about him. For instance, he was supposed to have had his face slapped at the Nicene Council, and he was also excommunicated. But some years afterwards, when Arius had toned it down a little, the Emperor Constantine decreed that Arius be allowed to take communion again, to show that the rift in the Christian church had healed. On his way to the ceremony, Arius urgently asked for a toilet, and he was taken to the nearest public toilet, where he died. Here's Joyce's line, again, with beaded mitre and with crosier, stalled upon his throne, widower of a widowed sea, with upstiffed Omophorion, with clotted hinderparts. His place in the church was as uncertain as that of a widower. He was in his robes, carrying his crosier, his mitre on his head. An Omophorion is a vestment that covers the shoulders. And as to his clotted hinderparts, the poor man died there and then, and it seems that he had either bowel or colon cancer. His death, and the scene of it, became a big deal in early church lore. Now, if you've been listening keenly, you'll be aware that I've skipped over something, but I've merely kept it until last. I'm talking about that long, long word, contransmagnificand jubangtantiality. Break it down. Contra, against, magnific, it has to be the Magnificat, that famous and rather gorgeous prayer. My soul doth magnify the Lord, and my spirit doth rejoice in God my Saviour. It's a great prayer. It's the hymn, if you prefer, of the Blessed Virgin Mary, extolling and delighting in her role as having given birth to God the Son, the Magnificat. Contransmagnific means simply that Arius was going against her declaration. Next words in the long word, and, Jew, bang. The expression that Jesus was a Jew recurs in Ulysses. Here, it's a reminder that not only was he the Son of God, he was Jewish. And bang is an onomatopoeic word, meaning that there was noise in Arius's life, and shiality, Tiality, well, isn't that a kind of catch-all suffix, as in, say, confidentiality? What a week. What stuff. More as ever next week. Rejoice, episode 102, Taking the Air. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. Welcome again to Chapter 3 of Ulysses. When Joyce discussed giving the chapters titles, this would have been Proteus, the god of the sea, ever-changing, shape-shifting, legendary. Stephen Dedalus, a young man in his early 20s, has spent a brief period this morning of the 16th of June 1904 teaching in a school south of Dublin, having spent the night with some friends in a tower on the coast. He's now on his way into Dublin to meet the same friends for a drink at noon in a pub called The Ship. The Ship, 12:30, Mulligan had called after him, remember, in Chapter 1. Now, Stephen's walking by the sea at Sandymount, a broad strand closer to Dublin, and he's using the wide open spaces to think, to test philosophies, to contemplate life with an uppercase L and existence with an uppercase E. He has seen nobody else except a pair of middle-aged, plumpish, feet-splayed women who suggest his thoughts are midwives. He even supplies names for them, even though they're too far away for him to recognize, even if he did know them. This midwife thought has led him to contemplation of birth and creation, and in due course to thoughts of God and the relationship between God the Almighty Father and his Son, Jesus Christ, and the early disputes as to whether Jesus was merely the Son of God or God in himself. And the final contemplation we looked at in last week's episode had to do with the death of Arius, the 4th century heretic who was central in that dispute, who died in Constantinople, that is to say, Istanbul, in a public lavatory from a last attack of what might have been bowel or colon cancer. Just thought I'd give you that little summary to start with this week. I haven't done it for a while. Now, as they say, read on. This is from the text. The first line is narrative. The rest is Stephen's thoughts. Airs romped around him, nipping and eager airs. They are coming, waves. The white-maned sea-horses, champing, bright-wind bridled. The steeds of Manannan. I mustn't forget his letter for the press. And after? The ship, 12:30. By the way, go easy with that bunny, like a good young imbecile. Yes, I must. 3 brief paragraphs there. The first consists of 3 sentences, one of which is third-party narration. The other 2 paragraphs are, as I said, Stephen's thoughts. Here's the third-party sentence. Airs romped round him, nipping and eager airs. Let's look at that. The word heirs. A pun on sons and heirs, since he's thinking of fathers and sons. Nipping and eager airs. Is that familiar? Obviously, little sea breezes, zephyrs, are playing with Stephen as he walks along. I've seen, I think, 18 productions of Hamlet. Can't get enough of it. And if you want to know, by the way, one of the pleasures of life, try this. Try sitting, listening to a good cast recording of Hamlet with the text open on your knee. Works for any Shakespeare, actually. Act 1 of Hamlet, the Prince of Denmark and his faithful friend Horatio have been told of a ghost on the battlements of the castle at Elsinore in Denmark, and they're waiting to see this spectre. Hamlet says to his dear Horatio, "The air bites shrewdly, it is very cold." And Horatio replies, "It is a nipping and eager air." And Hamlet says, "What hour now?" To which Horatio replies, "I think it lacks of 12. Then Marcellus says, "No, it has struck." But look at that. It seems to me that one of the great services that Joyce does throughout Ulysses, and truly embarks upon in chapter 3 here, is he shows us how thought processes fire off each other, synapses. It's a great part of the genius of the book. Stephen has a date at 12:30, and he's thinking of the word 12. So he's got his foot on the Hamlet train of thought for a moment. Lovely. That's lovely. Now we next have the line, "They're coming, waves," preparing us for the gorgeous sentence. The white-maned sea-horses, champing, bright-wind bridled, the steeds of Manannan. Oh, I love that. Here's what we have. To this day, people will say to you along the coasts of Ireland, the sea was full of white horses, meaning that the water was disturbed, the waves were tossing white foam, and the ocean can look like a herd of plunging, rearing white horses, their heads champing at the bit. And here, the horses of the sea are, in a made-up word compounded of 3 other words, they're bridled by the bright wind bridled. This is what I'm going after here, though, the steeds of Manannan. The word steed descends from the word stud, and we're back at the word mare again. We had it a few weeks ago. Mare and mare, the Latin word for the sea. Remember Madeline, my mare? The prize, though, here, the prize in this sentence, in this paragraph, is Manannan. And what a prize. Put up a sign for Joyce that reads, "Attention, genius at work." Manannan and Manannan MacLear were among the first Celtic deities. the first figures in our mythology that I heard of as a child in Ireland. Among the earliest invaders of the island were the Tuatha De Danann, the people of the goddess Danu, and they had a sea god, Manannán mac Lir. He was the lord of the sea, as was Proteus, and down beneath the waves his kingdom included the land of eternal youth. He lived in the middle of the Irish Sea on what we call to this day the Isle of Man, after Manannán. Sometimes he lived above the waves on the land. Sometimes he lived in his kingdom on the seabed, and he was the Irish Proteus, the changeable god of the sea, and he had 3 legs, which enabled him to leap across the mountains like a magic goat, or swim through the waves like a magic sea creature. And to this day, the crest of the Isle of Man is an emblem of 3 legs. I'll come back to that before we finish this week. Now, Manannán was brilliant. You'll hear of him later in Ulysses too. Manannán had armor that couldn't be pierced. He wore a helmet bright as the sun. He brandished a sword that killed with every blow. He rowed a boat that had neither oars nor sail and merely went where he told it to go. And the pigs on his farm were killed and eaten every day, but they were magically regenerated in time for tomorrow's meals. And now Joyce has him making, as it were, a guest appearance here. These waves, then, are Manannán's horses, whose only bridles are the bright wind bridled. And remember, one of the nearest landfalls, technically speaking, to the coast of that part of Ireland is the Isle of Man. As the crow flies, as the gull flies, as Manannán leaps, it's probably about 90 miles from Dublin. The last 2 paragraphs this week are comparatively straightforward. Stephen thinks, I mustn't forget his letter for the press, and after, the ship 12:30. By the way, go easy with that money like a good young imbecile. Yes, I must. Stephen is thinking of Mr. Deasy's exhortation about saving, as he pays Stephen his wages in chapter 2, put money in thy purse. And Stephen thinks, yes, I must go easy and not spend it all. Mr. Deasy has, of course, asked him to deliver a letter to the newspapers, which Mr. Deasy has written, about the foot and mouth disease in cattle and the importance and possible methods of keeping it out of Ireland. There's a tripwire here, by the way. Stephen is to meet Buck Mulligan in a pub called The Ship at 12:30. The opening concerns of Telemachus, the Stephen character in Homer's Odyssey, are frequently ship-based because he's sailing everywhere to find his father. There are ships everywhere in the Odyssey. And the last note, and I promised you this, Manannán mac Lir's 3 legs. Well, here's something that Joyce would have heard in the coarse underlife of Dublin's university students. Somebody, usually in drink, would have asked him, hey, Jim, how's the 3rd leg? The 3rd leg was a vulgar Dublin euphemism for the penis. And what have we been discussing earlier in this chapter, just a few paragraphs ago? We have been discussing birth, have we not? More rejoicing next week. Join me then.
The Storytellers, Frank Delaney's mythic series of short stories written in the narrative tradition, available for download at Amazon, or learn more at frankdelaney.com.
Rejoice, episode 103, Cost Accountants and Cornet Players. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney. We're a few pages into chapter 3 of Ulysses, and we're with Stephen Dedalus on his walk along Sandymount Strand. Now, his thought processes relax a little and become more familial and domestic. He steps aside from Aristotle and Arius and matters of life, theology, creation, and the universe and the whole damn thing, and wonders whether he should pay a visit on a relative nearby. Here we go. Stephen's thoughts mainly. I think I might have to leave some of this over until next week, but let me read it all to you anyway, because it all holds together. His pace slackened. Here, am I going to Aunt Sarah's or not? My consubstantial father's voice. Did you see anything of your artist brother Stephen lately? No? Sure, he's not down in Strasbourg Terrace with his Aunt Sally. Couldn't he fly a bit higher than that, eh? And tell us, Stephen, how is Uncle Si? Oh, weeping God, the things I married into. The boys up on the hayloft. the drunken little coster and his brother the cornet player, highly respectable gondoliers, and skew-eyed Walter, sirring his father no less. Sir, yes, sir, no, sir, Jesus wept, and no wonder by Christ. I pull the wheezy bell of their shuttered cottage, and wait. They take me for a dun, peer out from a coign of vantage. Is Stephen, sir? Let him in, let Stephen in. A bolt, drawn back, and Walter welcomes me. We thought you were someone else. End of quote. Now, whatever the density of the references, or whatever is going on, never forget that we're in a novel. That is to say, we have a raft of invented characters, at least invented as far as Joyce ever let himself invent anybody. In the fiction, Stephen imagines that he will call on his Aunt Sarah, a Mrs. Goulding, the wife of Richie Goulding, and Aunt Sarah is the sister-in-law of Stephen's deceased mother, because Richie Goulding is Stephen's mother's brother. Got that? Therefore, Stephen's uncle. Now, we have another raft of references here that becomes clear once you know the family connection. Joyce based the Gouldings on his mother's family, the Murrays. Richie Goulding was based on his mother's brother, William Murray. And now, let's look again at the sentences. Here, Stephen arrests himself, and at the same time thinks of where he is, near his aunt's. So here stops him, and here's where I am, he's thinking. Next sentence, am I going to Aunt Sarah's or not? Sandymount Strand is near enough to Ringsend and Irishtown for a visit. Then he imagines his father's caustic inquiry. He says, my consubstantial father's voice. And the father is saying, did you see anything of your artist brother Stephen lately? He's imagining a conversation. No? Sure, he's not down in Strasbourg Terrace with his Aunt Sally. The father, in Stephen's imagination, is talking to one of the sisters. Couldn't he fly a bit higher than that, eh? This is, indeed, the sarcastic voice of Simon Dedalus, the snivelling old loser we shall meet later. And Stephen, as I say, is imagining that conversation. It's probably one of Stephen's sisters. Aunt Sally is Aunt Sarah. Sarahs were often called Sally. There was indeed a Strasbourg Terrace, and there still is. It's probably harder to find now, with all the replanning and shunting of Dublin. And by the way, usually where you find a German street name in Dublin, it's a legacy from the days of British rule, when the Hanoverians were on the English throne and called everything after Germany. Nice little joke here, by the way. Couldn't he fly a bit higher than that, eh? Well, Icarus did fly higher on wings, made for him by his father, whose name was Daedalus. But of course, as we all know, the wings melted in the sun. And here you could have the most fascinating Freudian trope discussion about fathers who wish for the deaths of their sons. Very, very ancient thinking. Here's the next piece of text. We look at it. Stephen is imagining the conversation he's going to have with Uncle Richie, whose speech he mimics in his mind, because Stephen is still channeling his father's voice. And tell us, Stephen, how is Uncle Si? That's Uncle Richie's voice. And then Simon again, all weeping God, the things I married into. So there you are, in his thoughts. Stephen is echoing his own father, lamenting having married into low-rent folks. And here's the point. Joyce is also echoing Ulysses directly. Ulysses being Odysseus. Because all across Homer's Odyssey, and especially and even more so in the Iliad, you find characters who rant, mostly at their circumstances, but at other people. It's remarkably modern in that sense. In the Iliad, for instance, there's the figure in Book 2 of Thersites, whose vile complaints are silenced by the quick and noble tongue of Odysseus. It's great stuff, and I'm going to quote it to you because it's instructive in the consideration of Ulysses and how the dialogue in Ulysses is constructed. And later on, there is a character you'll meet called the Citizen who rants to a phenomenal degree. Here's a quote from the Samuel Butler translation, which is old, but I still like it. Here we go. From the Iliad. The rest now took their seats and kept to their own several places. But Thersites still went on wagging his unbridled tongue, a man of many words, and those unseemly, a monger of sedition, a railer against all who were in authority, who cared not what he said, so that he might set the Achaeans in a laugh. He was the ugliest man of all those that came before Troy, bandy-legged, lame of one foot, with his two shoulders rounded and hunched over his chest. His head ran up to a point, but there was little hair on the top of it. Achilles and Ulysses hated him worst of all, for it was with them that he was most wont to wrangle. Now, however, with a shrill, squeaky voice, he began heaping his abuse on Agamemnon. The Achaeans were angry and disgusted, yet none the less he kept on brawling and bawling at the son of Atreus. "Agamemnon," he cried, "what ails you now, and what more do you want? Your tents are filled with bronze and with fair women, for whenever we take a town we give you the pick of them. Would you have yet more gold, which some Trojan is to give you as a ransom for his son, when I or another Achaean has taken him prisoner, or is it some young girl to hide and lie with? It's not well that you, the ruler of the Achaeans, should bring them into such misery. Weakling cowards, women rather than men, let us sail home and leave this fellow here at Troy to stew." Thus railed Thersites, but Ulysses, that's Odysseus, at once went up to him and rebuked him sternly. "Check your glib tongue, Thersites," said he, "and babble not a word further. Chide not with princes when you have none to back you. There is no viler creature come before Troy with the sons of Atreus. Drop this chatter about kings, and neither revile them nor keep harping about going home. We do not yet know how things are going to be, nor whether the Achaeans are to return with good success or evil. How dare you jibe at Agamemnon? I tell you, therefore, and it shall surely be, that if I again catch you talking such nonsense, I will either forfeit my own head and be no more called father of Telemachus, or I will take you, strip you stark naked, and whip you out of the assembly till you go blubbering back to the ships." End of quote. See, I told you it was great stuff. I'm sorry for the digression, but as the book goes on, you'll find that that's actually quite an important piece of example. In the next piece of text, Stephen is imagining further ranting from his father, and this one is very interesting, a remark out of the blue. "The boys up in the hayloft." I come to it next week, when we shall also have gondoliers and cornet players and debt collectors. Bye-bye. Rejoice. Episode 105, Irish Bull. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney, and as we head into year 3 of Rejoice, let's go straight to this week's quote from Chapter 3 of Ulysses. Once again, we're in the thoughts of Stephen Dedalus as he walks along Sandymount Strand. This is what he's thinking. Here's the quote. "In his broad bed, Nuncle Richie, pillowed and blanketed, extends over the hillock of his knees a sturdy forearm. Clean-chested, he has washed the upper moiety. Mara, nephew." He lays aside the lapboard, whereon he drafts his bills of costs for the eyes of Master Goff and Master Chaplain Tandy, filing consents and common searches and a writ of duces tecum. A bog oak frame over his bald head. Wilde's Requiescat. End of quote. Well, this is an actual scene from life, half narrated by Joyce and half in Stephen's thoughts, as a kind of mock-heroic medieval. And if you find this stylistic and arresting, just wait. There's a bunch of it in this novel. Here, though, we can see the pictures. In his broad bed, Nuncle Richie, pillowed and blanketed, extends over the hillock of his knees a sturdy forearm. Don't you love Nuncle? You probably recognize it. It's what the fool calls King Lear. "How now, Nuncle?" And that great speech in Act 1 that begins, "Mark it, Nuncle, have more than thou showest, speak less than thou knowest, lend less than thou owest, ride more than thou goest." And given the scene of Uncle Richie sitting up in bed, I wonder if Joyce knew a poem, I bet he did, by Robert Louis Stevenson called "The Land of Counterpane." It's in that lovely book, A Child's Garden of Verses, and it's got the line, "Among the bedclothes through the hills." You see? Extends over the hillock of his knees. Didn't you play as a child in bed, imagining your knees to be mountains under the bedspread? I love the next bit. A sturdy forearm. You can see that. Sturdy forearm. Clean-chested. He's not wearing pajamas or anything. And then here comes the line. He has washed the upper moiety. The upper moiety. That's one of my favorite sentences in all of Ulysses. It always makes me laugh. Moiety is an interesting word, actually. It doesn't just mean the upper portion, it means the upper equal portion. So moiety is half of Uncle Richie's body in this case. Next, we have Uncle Richie's grandiose salutation, Morrow, nephew. In other words, good morrow, meaning good day. But, it isn't as simple as that. It rarely is in Ulysses. Try this, these lines from the English Elizabethan poet George Gascoigne, whose work Joyce almost certainly had encountered. Listen. You that have spent the silent night in sleep and quiet rest, and a joy to see the cheerful light that riseth in the east, now clear your voice and cheer your heart. Come help me now to sing. Uncle Richie, a singer, is still in bed after his night's sleep. But there's something even more interesting here, and I've only just discovered this, and I want to report it to you now. I've been working, and a number of you have been kind enough to ask, I've been working basically from a few different texts. For convenience, I've been using a Penguin paperback from a UK Bodley Head edition of 1960. The paperback came out sometime in the 70s, I think. So that's basically the Bodley Head edition, the UK edition of 1960. I've been using the Random House US edition of 1961. I've also been using an old 1928 edition. And I've been using the now famous 1986 Gabler edition from Hans Walter Gabler. Now, in the 1960 and the 1928 editions, the text says, Morrow, nephew, and moves on to, he lays aside the lapboard whereon he drafts, etc., which sentence we'll be unpacking in a moment. But in the Gabler edition, there is an extra sentence. After Uncle Richie greets Stephen, Morrow, nephew, he says, in the Gabler edition, sit down and take a walk. Sit down and take a walk. Did the original manuscript contain that? I bet it did. Because it's not only very Joycean, it's very Irish. We had all kinds of word games like that growing up. Twice a week and once a fortnight. Or, to a boy riding a horse, get down and see yourself above, meaning climb down and see what you look like when you're up there. Now, those linguistic tricks and jugglings, they belong in a field of language jiggery-pokery that we called an Irish bull. The Irish bull was, I think we've had this before, I'm not sure. It's worth repeating. It was a kind of speech oddity. We made them up for fun. But when it's done deliberately, the Irish bull lies at the door of an old Irish politician, Boyle Roche, who perpetrated it without knowing that he did. He said in Parliament one day, why should we do anything for posterity? What has posterity ever done for us? He also said, my cup of happiness is overflowing and is not yet half full. The definition of an Irish bull, by the way, is this. If there were 13 cows lying down in a field and one of them was standing up, that would be an Irish bull. So now you have it. You understand it completely. Right, back to this week's text. Next sentence. He lays aside the lapboard whereon he drafts his bills of costs for the eyes of Master Goff and Master Chaplain Tandy. By the way, did you get that when Uncle Richie says, sit down and take a walk? It's a contradiction. Sit down and take a walk. How can you take a walk sitting down? You got it. Okay. He lays aside the lapboard whereon he drafts his bills of costs for the eyes of Master Goff and Master Chaplain Tandy, filing consents and common searches and a writ of duces tecum, a bog oak frame over his bald head, Wilde's Requiescat. What we have here is a piece of nonsense, or maybe not, followed by those poignant, swift tugs Joyce does so well, tugs at the heartstrings. He pulls them out so expertly, and he has within it a connection, at the same time, to some of the chapter's intellectual and literary concerns. First, the piece of nonsense. Stephen continues his thought in the mock medieval style he's been using to think about his Uncle Richie, who has a board across his lap as a kind of bed desk. Uncle Richie, sitting up in bed, is plying his trade as a cost drawer, an accountant of sorts, whose employers are Master Goff and Master Chaplain Tandy. Names, names, names. In Joyce, there's always something behind the name. So who was Goff and who was Chaplain Tandy? Well, There are multiple possibilities here. And whereas with Joyce you have to allow for all, I'm going to major on one. There was a Gough family in Dublin at the time. There are still Goughs there. There were Chaplins too. It's a name connected to a family in the minor Irish aristocracy, the name Carew. Chaplins were married to Carews. Carews were married to Chaplins. There was an Irish revolutionary by the name of Napper Tandy. He crops up in ballads. Oh, I met with Napper Tandy, and he shook me by the hand, and he said, how's dear old Ireland, and how does she stand? James Napper Tandy, son of a Dublin shopkeeper. He was a great favourite of Napoleon's. Big name in Irish 19th century politics. Big nose, too. His ugliness was as famous as his revolutionary sympathy. Then there's Lawrence Sterne's great novel, The Adventures of Tristram Shandy. Not beyond Joyce to trick around with that. But, and here's my main point, I can't yet prove this, but it's my bet. I wonder, did the names Gough, Chaplin, and Tandy appear in the Freeman's Journal, the big Dublin daily newspaper, on the 16th of June 1904? Master Gough and Master Chaplin Tandy. Uncle Richie, let me remind you, is filing consents and common searches and a writ of duces tecum. So, who knows? They might have been names on a legal register for courts that day, cases being heard. Right, a writ of duces tecum. A writ of duces tecum is essentially a subpoena, ordering you to bring to me, the court, that is, evidence that the court has asked for. The court clearly understands the ineluctable modality of the visible, which is where this chapter began. The bog oak frame above Uncle Richie's head must be some kind of sampler above the bed, and inscribed on it there's a poem by Oscar Wilde. And the poem, this is where he tugs at the heartstrings. The poem, Requiescat, begins, tread lightly, she is near, under the snow. Speak gently, she can hear the daisies grow. All her bright golden hair tarnished with rust, she that was young and fair, fallen to dust. Oscar wrote that poem about the death of his sister, Isola, who died at the age of 9 when Oscar was 13. Remember, Uncle Richie is the brother of Stephen's mother who has died. And the poem and Uncle Richie would have remembered her as a girl too. And remember that we have been reading Stephen's thoughts about visible and audible and their modalities, ineluctable and not. Here you come to Joyce's genius. In his discussion of visible and audible modality, he's thinking out loud. We've had all this. Because we cannot see or hear something, in this case, somebody, that is to say, Uncle Richie's dead sister, does it mean that they are not there? What about ghosts? And what a brilliant literary fusion of thought. I'll be back next week. Rejoice, episode 105A, Meet Mr. Joyce. Hello, I'm Frank Delaney, and happy Bloomsday. Wherever you are, all over the world, enjoy this day, the 16th of June, that we celebrate wildly, or at least remark upon, all because of a book. Because of a book by an Irish writer, a single novel that was seen as a masterpiece the day it was first published, and is now regarded as one of the world's great works of art, which it is. And as we meditate upon the day at the center of the book, the 16th of June 1904, a day on which so many ordinary events and people became components in a work of art, let me take the opportunity to thank all of you who, in your legions, have been in touch with me since I began these Joyce podcasts 2 years ago today. We're a smidgen away from, and may, even as I speak, be hitting the 500,000 mark for downloads. 500,000. We had 10,000 a couple of days last week alone. And I'm touched and grateful for your support and your interest. And please forgive me if I don't reply to your individual comments. There have been simply too many for me to cope. Instead, why don't I give something back? Many of you have described yourselves to me as newcomers to Joyce, And you've often asked how to get into him, so to speak. Well, in this special edition, my Bloomsday tribute, I thought I'd do a thumbnail breakdown of, to my mind, the best way to begin with James Joyce. So I'm going to dip into his first published book of fiction, the collection of 15 short stories that he called Dubliners. And then, when the next Baker's Dozen edition comes along in a few weeks, remember, we're due one after episode 108. I do them every 12 podcasts. I'll dip into the second 5 stories. And in the Baker's Dozen edition that comes 12 podcasts after that, that's episode 120, I'll finish dipping into the entire collection. So please then settle back and listen to my take on the first 5 stories in Dubliners. And I hope that I increase your existing enjoyment of Joyce, and perhaps even better, encourage you towards him forever and ever. Here we go. Dubliners appeared as a single volume in the year 1914, but it had been written long before. Joyce left Ireland in the fall of 1904, and in the year 1905 he got all the stories of Dubliners down on paper. He'd been making notes for all kinds of writing all the time. He'd even had poems published. He fetched up in Trieste, and despite horrendous domestic circumstances, living in debt, moving apartments, a pregnant girlfriend who didn't speak Italian, laid low by the tremendous heat, and then a baby, despite all that, he assembled the 15 stories. In fact, he wrote some of them, it seems, in a matter of days. Let me give you the names of the 15 stories. Here we go. The Sisters, An Encounter, Araby, Eveline, After the Race. Two Gallants, The Boarding House, A Little Cloud, Counterparts, Clay. A Painful Case, Ivy Day in the Committee Room, A Mother, Grace, and The Dead. Each is remarkable for the modernity, clarity, and simplicity of its writing. And even as early as that in his life, he was 23. 23. Joyce, evidently, had massive literary gifts. His trademarks had already begun to appear. In each story, he makes you look and listen as well as read, and in each story, he can stop you dead with a moment of poignancy or deep, tearful almost, concern. It's worth noting at this point, before we get into detail, how he saw the stories. The first 3, The Sisters, An Encounter, and Araby, he said they were stories of his childhood. After the Race, The Boarding House, and Eveline, he called them stories of adolescence. Clay, Counterparts, A Painful Case, stories, he said, of mature life. Ivy Day in the Committee Room, A Mother, and Grace. Those, he said, were stories of public life in Dublin. Those 12 he first sent off to a publisher. And in the intervening 10 years he was arguing, 10 years of disputes with publishers, he added Two Gallants, A Little Cloud, and that mighty story, The Dead. So, here we go with the first 5 stories. First, The Sisters. It's told through the eyes of a young boy. A priest has died in the house of the priest's own 2 sisters, Nanny and Eliza. The boy narrator has known the priest. They've had quite a lot of communication. Quote, he had studied in the Irish College in Rome, and he had taught me to pronounce Latin properly. He had told me stories about the catacombs and about Napoleon Bonaparte, and he had explained to me the meaning of different ceremonies of the Mass and of the different vestments worn by the priest. Sometimes he had amused himself by putting difficult questions to me, asking me what one should do in certain circumstances, or whether such and such sins were mortal or venial or only imperfections. Further down the paragraph, the boy recollects an image of the old priest. Quote, when he smiled, he used to uncover his big discolored teeth and let his tongue lie upon his lower lip, a habit which made me feel uneasy in the beginning of our acquaintance before I knew him well. Indeed, when you read the story, don't be surprised if, in general, you get a kind of queasy feeling. I've always thought that there seem to be things unsaid here, perhaps, maybe even very grave things, and that very life beneath the surface is one source of the story's power. The second source is the immediacy of the writing. Not only might this story have been written last week or last year, you are present with the boy. His point of view takes you into his confidence. as he considers his relationship with the old priest and how it now gets jolted when the man dies. And Joyce being Joyce. The third source of power is the brilliant, brilliant image making. Just one example. His face was very truculent, grey and massive, with black, cavernous nostrils. The second story in the collection, An Encounter, is told by the same boy, and it's even creepier. The young, prepubescent Joyce assume that these are autobiographical, and his friend Mahony go mitching from school. Mitching is a good old Dublin word for a day's truant, cutting classes. And they meet a man in a field, a disturbing man, who clearly gets off not only on meeting little boys, but by talking about whipping them. It's full of menace and rearview mirror character observation, and it has a wonderful final paragraph. And here we come immediately to the unusualness of Joyce's work. He had a fabulous range, and he was fearless in his choice of topics. In that first story, you might be asking yourself whether other people thought that the old priest had about him a touch of pedophilia. In this story, as though to consolidate the idea, you're left in no doubt. The strange man in the field has asked the narrator and his friend whether they have sweethearts. The text continues, his attitude on this point struck me as strangely liberal in a man of his age. In my heart, I thought that what he said about boys and sweethearts was reasonable. But I disliked the words in his mouth, and I wondered why he shivered once or twice, as if he feared something, or felt a sudden chill. As he proceeded, I noticed that his accent was good. He began to speak to us about girls, saying what nice soft hair they had, and how soft their hands were, and how all girls were not so good as they seemed to be, if one only knew. Now comes the sinister bit. After a long while, his monologue paused. He stood up slowly, saying that he had to leave us for a minute or so, a few minutes, and without changing the direction of my gaze, I saw him walking slowly away from us, towards the near end of the field. We remained silent when he had gone. After a silence of a few moments, I heard Mahony exclaim, I say, look what he's doing. And it becomes clear that the man is masturbating. Now imagine that being written into literature in 1905. You can see why publishers had difficulty accepting Dubliners. In the third story of Dubliners, Araby, so different from the first two, the same boy narrator is obsessed with a girl who lives on his street. Quote, every morning I lay on the floor in the front parlour watching her door. The blind was pulled down to within an inch of the sash, so that I could not be seen. When she came out on the doorstep, my heart leapt. I ran to the hall, seized my books, and followed her. I kept her brown figure always in my eye, and when we came near the point at which our ways diverged, I quickened my pace and passed her. This happened morning after morning. I had never spoken to her except for a few casual words, and yet her name was like a summons to all my foolish blood. It's a story about disappointment. When, at last, they speak, the girl initiates the conversation by asking the boy was he going to Araby, a great bazaar then being held in Dublin. She's unable to go, she says, and the boy longs to go there and buy her something to make up for the fact that she can't go. But by the time he gets to Araby, it's late in the evening, the bazaar is closing, and anyway, he knows that he can't afford to get her something of real value. It's a story full of metaphor. It's a story full of passion and erotic loneliness, and it's a story with a different and savage twist on what amounts to a loss of innocence. Here's just one example. My body was like a harp, and her words and gestures were like fingers running on the wires. Araby haunts me. It's a near-perfect rendition, as I remember, of that terrifyingly exciting half-world of early erotic feeling. What makes it interesting in particular is the unusualness of the characterization of the girl. Typically, early adolescent male love objects are rendered as teachers or an older woman. Here, it's a girl within the narrator's own age range, which means that Joyce implicitly sexualizes the girl too. And all through the story, He conjures images that reinforce aspects of the boy's mood, the boy's feelings, the boy's intentions. On his way to Araby, for example, he is alone in the bare carriage of the train. Inside the almost deserted bazaar, he observes a young lady talking and laughing with two young gentlemen. So it's flirtation, sexual aspiration. They hum through this story, twinned with erotic desperation. And there's a devastating last sentence. I won't spoil it for you, but when you read it twice. The second time, read it out loud. Eveline, story number 4, is the tale of a girl whose mother has died, and she lives with a crude and menacing father. But she has a beau, luckily, named Frank, who wants her to run away with him, and they will set up a new life in Buenos Aires. Joyce's third-person narrator tells us her thoughts. In her new home, in a distant, unknown country, she would be married, she, Eveline. People would treat her with respect then. She would not be treated as her mother had been. Even now, though she was over 19, she sometimes felt herself in danger of her father's violence. She knew it was that had given her the palpitations. When they were growing up, he had never gone for her, like he used to go for Harry and Ernest, because she was a girl. But latterly, he had begun to threaten her, and say what he would do to her, only for her dead mother's sake. And now she had nobody to protect her. End of quote. The handsome mariner, who is, as Joyce puts it in her view, very kind, manly, open-hearted, presses her to come with him to Argentina. Naturally, the handsome lover soon falls foul of the father, and Eveline has to go on keeping her trysts a secret from that moment. And then comes the time to embark on the boat, the wonderful boat that will take her away from everything. It's a heartbreaking story about choice and about the numbness of making the wrong choice. What I find interesting about it is the internalization of the main character, who's not obviously, at any rate, the young Joyce himself. And the story, here's the marvelous thing about it. It echoes in your spirit long after you've read it. Only a great writer can do that. By the way, here's something really interesting. There's a moment in the story Eveline that gives a hint of things to come, by which I mean that Joyce throws in a couple of words that have kept the professors busy for years, which was his stated intent with Ulysses in Finnegan's Wake. He said, my work will keep the professors busy for 100 years. Eveline remembers her put-upon mother's eventual dementia, in which the mother repeated like a chant 2 words that people have never been able to put together. Deravon Serawan. Odd. They seem to have no context. The speculation as to what the 2 words mean has been long, wide, and varied. And down the decades, for almost a century now, all kinds of suggestions have surfaced, from nonsense words, or those phonetically interesting syllabic constructions. Dip into Finnegan's Wake and see how much Joyce loved those, to a specific translation from perhaps Gaelic, and the translation that's offered always is, the end of pleasure is pain. Well, here's my thought. The words are Gaelic, or Irish as we called it growing up, and the phrase breaks down like this. Deravon Serawain. The end, dera, of a woman. Woman is ban, genitive case van. Dera van, end of a woman. Free is ser, and on a wine, meaning one or singular. So the old demented lady, the poor thing, could be chanting the end of a singular free woman. Deravan Serawan. That's my interpretation. I bet Joyce would smirk right now if he could hear me. Story number 5 in Dubliners, After the Race, changes everything again in this collection. It has nothing whatsoever in common with the 4 previous stories. It's in a different class, it has a different mood, it has different concerns, it has different atmosphere. In fact, it would not be out of place in today's glossy magazines. It has more than a touch of Vanity Fair or Esquire about it. It tells, in the beginning, of a road race Here are the opening sentences. The cars came scudding in towards Dublin, running evenly like pellets in the groove of the Naas Road. At the crest of the hill at Inchicore, sightseers had gathered in clumps to watch the cars careering homeward, and through this channel of poverty and inaction, the continent sped its wealth and industry. You see, in the first two sentences, Joyce lays down his markers. That's the stamp of the true short story writer, because a short story is so brief, you have to accomplish everything so fast. After the race, four well-off young men about town attempt to make the jollity last until the following day. One is a Frenchman, one was born in Canada, one is a Hungarian, and the fourth is a Dubliner. And that's one of the main points of the story, the dipping of a Dublin toe in the waters of international cosmopolitania. The story has style, it has chic, there is money on the table, it's not grim or emotionally sinister, and you almost begin to wonder if it might have been written by a different author, except here again are the brilliant flashes of image making. Just one example. The harbour lay like a darkened mirror at their feet. And also, there is the unmistakable atmosphere of Dublin, no matter what the level of society, because Joyce said that he wanted, in Dubliners, to give the Irish a chance to look at themselves in what he called my nicely polished looking glass. If he had never written anything but these 5 stories, The Sisters, An Encounter, Araby, Evelyn, After the Race, James Joyce would have put a masterpiece in our hands. But the best was to come, in Dubliners, and miraculously almost elsewhere. So, once again, happy Bloomsday.